Hello, this is Nick Nielsen of Grand Strategy, The View from Oregon. Today, I'll be talking about inverting Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Perhaps one of the most familiar psychological ideas of our time is the Maslowian hierarchy of needs, and the most familiar form of the exposition of the hierarchy of needs is that of a pyramid resting on a broad base of physiological needs, on top of which are needs of safety and security. Above these come love and belonging, then self-esteem, finally culminating with self-actualization at the peak of the pyramid. In one of Maslow's briefest expositions of the hierarchy of needs, he wrote, quote, "Man is a hierarchy of needs, with the biological needs at the base of the hierarchy and the spiritual needs at the top," unquote. From Abraham Maslow's The Farther Reaches of Human Nature, page 186. To fully appreciate Maslow's hierarchy of needs and his humanistic psychology, which serves as a conceptual framework of the hierarchy of needs, all of this must be understood in comparison to, and indeed in contradistinction to, the tradition of Freudian psychodynamic psychology, which, when Maslow was writing, was the dominant school of thought in psychology. Freud began as a physician, and he approached the human psyche as a physician. Success in Freudian psychology is formulated in the most minimal and modest way imaginable. This is the source of the famous idea that, quote, "Much will be gained if we succeed in transforming your hysterical misery into common unhappiness. With a mental life that has been restored to health, you will be better armed against that unhappiness," unquote. From Freud's Studies in Hysteria, translated and edited by James Strachey. Freud did not focus on what makes an individual mentally healthy, but on treating specific pathologies. Patients came to him with problems, and he tried to cure them. The cure was considered efficacious if the patient was relieved of their neurotic misery and returned to a condition of ordinary human unhappiness. In reading Maslow's Toward a Psychology of Being, I have been struck by the degree to which Maslow comes across as consciously and systematically trying to formulate a comprehensive psychology in opposition to Freud. What I mean by opposition to Freud is that Maslow's doctrines, which he conveniently sums up in the final chapter of Toward a Psychology of Being, carefully avoid central Freudian doctrines which seem to focus without exception on what we might call the positive aspects of human psychology. Maslow is very ready to admit human limitations and failings, but his own failing seems to me to be a misreading of Freud. Freud and psychoanalysis have been commonly derided for its negative approach to the study of the mind, but Freud himself rejected this characterization. In the very last of his new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, Freud has a wonderful chapter on the place of psychoanalysis within science and the scientific worldview, in which he defends psychoanalysis as having extended scientific research to the realm of the mind. But the psychodynamic model of the mind in Freud's hands gives a great deal of attention to the ways in which people misunderstand themselves. These failures of self-understanding, so crucial to the psychoanalytical conception of the mind, seem almost absent in Maslow, and Maslow seems, according to my reading, to be avoiding this merely for the sake of rejecting Freud and formulating a positive model of the mind. This situation is closely parallel to the vogue that existentialist philosophy had in the 1950s and 1960s. It was thought to be an entirely negative philosophy, concerned with guilt, dread, anxiety, and death. Many people felt justified in rejecting existentialism on these grounds, essentially because they saw it as detrimental to human happiness, even if they knew nothing in detail about existentialism and its doctrines. Sartre, the most famous of the existentialists, rejected the characterization of existentialism as anything negative, and publicly stated that he regarded it as the most optimistic of philosophies because it affirms human freedom, and in this I concur. Sartre also had an interest in psychoanalysis and formulated his own psychoanalytic doctrines in which self-deception has a central role. As different as Freud and Sartre were, both recognized the role that self-deception plays in the functions of the mind, and it is the utter neglect of this important insight which seems to me to vitiate, or at least seriously weaken, Maslow's attempt to formulate a third way in psychology based on a reactionary reading of Freud. Part of the difference between Freud's approach and Maslow's approach may be put to the obvious reason that Freud was seeking treatments for serious mental pathologies, while Maslow had something very different in mind. Maslow was trying to describe a healthy, fully functional human being. His systematic works, like The Psychology of Being, don't focus on the treatment of specific pathologies, but instead seek to understand and define the human person in its optimal state of being, especially in relation to peak experiences and self-fulfillment. Ordinary human unhappiness is not good enough for Maslow. He wants to see the healthy individual converge upon a state of psychological self-actualization in which the highest spiritual goods are realized and personal fulfillment is achieved. All of this sounds wonderfully inspirational, but I am deeply disturbed by the implications of Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the same way that I am deeply suspicious of Erik Erikson's stages of personality development. One way to formulate Maslow's project would be to say that his humanistic psychology is aspirational, though if we were to say instead that it was prescriptive, while Freud's psychodynamic psychology was descriptive, we might begin to see something potentially troubling in Maslow. Let me try to explain why I find this troubling. There is a perennial human tendency, perhaps rooted in some cognitive bias or biases, to mistake or even to twist a description into a prescription, transforming an analysis into a norm. Thus, one might say that if you aren't experiencing the particular psychosocial crisis that Erik Erikson has defined for the stage of life in which you find yourself at present, then there is something obviously wrong with you, and you aren't developing naturally or normally. Or one might say that when you are dying, if you have failed to pass through the 5 stages of dying as delineated by Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, that you have failed to die properly. Similarly, it might be asserted that if you are not going about clambering up the hierarchy of needs in an orderly and linear fashion, starting with the satisfaction of your physiological needs and gradually working your way up to spiritual self-actualization, then there is obviously something wrong with you, and you need to start over and get it right the next time. One cannot, of course, blame Maslow or Erikson for the dumbed-down versions of their ideas that have filtered into mass consciousness by way of simplified expositions in the mass media, but there are insidious assumptions built into the hierarchy of needs and, as well, into Erikson's stages of psychosocial development that are intrinsic even to the most refined and sophisticated expositions. Let me start with something basic, something drawn from the most fundamental physiological human needs. Even if you are tired, hungry, thirsty, and cold, if you see a violent mob moving in your direction, you are going to run the other way to keep yourself alive, despite your immediate physiological needs. While these physiological needs are the basis of human well-being, I can't imagine Maslow telling someone about to be murdered by a mob that they ought to get something to eat and drink, put on more layers of clothing, then get a good night's rest of sleep before running to save their lives. This is the reductio ad absurdum of the hierarchy of needs, and such an observation in no way vitiates the overall scheme, insofar as any general scheme must admit of exceptions. If that were all, appropriate exceptions could be built into the hierarchy of needs to accommodate immediate exigencies. But that isn't all. The very idea that our moral life is a distant and expensive luxury that occurs at a peak of self-fulfillment and self-actualization, and perhaps only reserved for exemplary individuals, is so profoundly misleading that it falsifies what it means to be human. Let us consider another example. If you find yourself isolated, without friends or family, and thus lacking all the components of love and belonging, and, to formulate this even more strongly, perhaps you see no way whatsoever of lifting yourself out of this isolation, but you nevertheless use this isolation to focus on the fulfillment of a higher creative or moral calling, instead of fruitlessly expending your energies trying to fulfill this level of the hierarchy of needs in order to move up to the next level in an orderly and purposeful manner. Is your flaunting of the hierarchy of needs a sign of your pathology? Some of the greatest works of art in human history, the pinnacle of achievement of what would ordinarily be thought of as the work of exemplary individuals, has grown out of circumstances that seem to pervert every assumption built into the hierarchy of needs. Certainly there is a sense in which the construction of great communal projects such as the Parthenon, Chartres Cathedral, or the Taj Mahal rest on an established material and intellectual framework that is the civilizational equivalent of physiological needs. But the hierarchy of needs was formulated to describe individual psychology and not the functioning of exemplary civilizations, though it may be applicable to this also, mutatis mutandis. Certainly in some individuals we see a progressive fulfillment of needs from the physiological to the intellectual, but I don't think this is an adequate or even a fair portrayal of the further reaches of human nature. I have often said that I don't believe a person can get out of bed in the morning without implicitly having formulated a philosophical judgment that life is worth living, and therefore there is a reason to get out of bed and not merely to lie there and do nothing. Taking this as the basis for all else that follows from this experience of the human condition, it is in this sense that I have used raison d'être as the foundation of an inverted hierarchy of needs in the accompanying illustration. From the individual's raison d'être at the foundation of an inverted hierarchy of needs, there follows, in perfectly reversed order, the fulfillment of emotional and psychological drives, eventually building up to the final satisfaction of physical drives and needs. In my hierarchy of needs, the moral need of the individual to realize himself or herself and to fully become what he or she is, constitutes the foundation upon which all else rests. Above this comes the will to live, which is the individual's confidence to act upon their moral raison d'être. Next higher is the social network within which one is able to act effectively to attain one's moral development. Resting on this is a predictable environment in which one's physiological needs can be routinely and satisfactorily met. And at the top of this hierarchy of needs comes the realization of the physiological needs, which often take the form of conspicuous luxuries such as a full night of sleep, indulging in fine foods, and living in a comfortable home. While it is true that if you do meet basic and immediate physical needs, such as excuse me, while it is true that if you do not meet basic and immediate physiological needs, such as not having air to breathe, you will die within minutes, and if you do not have water to drink, you will die within days. Such immediate exigencies can be compared to the immediate exigencies noted above in relation to Maslow's formulation of the hierarchy of needs. The existence of these immediate contingencies in no way vitiate the overall scheme. An inverted hierarchy of needs admits of certain exceptions, certainly. Granted these exceptions, I find this to be a much more accurate and more satisfying depiction of actual human experience than Maslow's version. Thank you.